Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. We're excited because we just got back from the NWTF convention. Actually, we haven't gone yet. We're recording this before the convention. But we're excited about this because we're doing another Mississippi State University extension. Their Deer Lab puts out these papers periodically, and this is one that we've referenced several times. We're going to go through it kind of like we did a couple weeks ago. Really excited about that. Jacob, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing really good, really good. I know this is coming out after NWTF, but I'm very excited about the show. So,
For sure.
You know, by the time this episode came out, maybe some of you guys got to meet us at NWTF again. Really excited about the whole event. It's so fun to be able to go see everybody. But this week, again, the study that we're going to be talking about, I'm really interested in because, again, like Andrew, you mentioned, we've referenced this many a times on the podcast, but we've never actually gone in detail about the study. And I think this is going to be something very fascinating. Actually, we referenced this study, I guess it was last week?
Yeah, last Thursday.
Last Thursday's episode, we talked about this study a little bit without actually having the study in front of us. But this week, we're actually going to break it down for you guys and see the importance that nutrition versus genetics makes when it comes to, you know, quality deer in an area.
Yeah, for sure.
Which kind of goes back. I'll say this. Can I start this off? If you hear guys talk about this all the time, and last week I gave this example, when we had Richard Fott on the podcast a couple times back in the day, you know, he hunts on a part of Arkansas where there's some very large deer, okay, public land, the whole 9 yards. And we reference Clifton Denny, who had talked to Richard back in the day about him wanting to kill Pope and young deer every year. Well, Clifton lives in an area that very few 125-inch deer ever got killed there. And Richard was telling him, like, dude, if you want to do that, you need to go to an area that, you know, those deer live and actually, you know, you had that opportunity to kill this deer. And the second Clifton didn't, he started killing Pope and young deer every single year on public. And this plays directly a part of that kind of conversation, which is, again, you know, is that a genetic issue where like some areas just genetically don't have the deer in the genes in order to produce larger bucks, or is it a nutrition issue?
Or is it both?
Or is it both? And we're going to talk about that. So it's very, very interesting, and this is something I've been very excited to be able to talk about. So this is something definitely, guys, I think you're going to really enjoy, and we'll just hop on into it.
Yeah, another thing, by the way, so we just talked about we had the NWTF convention this past weekend. This coming weekend, on February 24th, we've got the Weaver Meat Processing Hunters Meetup, second annual Hunters Meetup. Make sure y'all come to that. It's a free event, family-friendly. There's going to be food and drink provided by Weaver Meat Processing. You can bring a buck and get it scored. You can, you know, grab the mount off your wall that you killed back in the day, and you're like, man, I wonder what that thing scores. Like, never had it scored. You can bring it and have it scored, entered in the record book if you want to do that.
Or, in addition to like getting a deer scored, we've had a lot of listeners reach out to us that they want to bring deer to get scored because they've scored it themselves and they want to see how close they got to the official score of it. So again, if you've measured a couple of your deer and you're just curious like how close you are, you can bring it and get it measured for free. Mm-hmm. And if you decide, you know, if you make, you know, the Buckmaster's record book, you can pay, I think it's like $25, whatever, to be entered into the book. So
you get you a book.
I really don't care about the whole book thing, but it is kind of cool to get like an official score of some deer. So again, like I had a deer, I took one of my velvet buck, 8-point. He was bigger than I thought he was.
Yeah.
And I never had put a tape to him, but I underestimated how big he was, and I was pleasantly surprised.
I overestimated how big my 10-point was, which we just got back from old Daniel Williams. He's oh my gosh, I'm going to make everything fall over. Here he is. You see that? So I got this one scored last year, and he was smaller than I thought he was. So that's interesting.
Yep.
But anyways, yeah, come get them scored. It's super fun, and we're going to be there. And it's always fun to meet everybody, dude. It's always fun to meet listeners.
Yeah, we'll have Southern Outdoorsman apparel there. There'll be a lot of past podcast guests there as well. So it's going to be a really good time. I'm super excited to be able to kind of spend time with everybody for the whole day. Come and go as you want. Family friendly. It's going to be a really good time. So anyways, just want to let y'all know before we hop on to the episode. But
yes, sir. All right. Let's jump into it.
By the way, probably should mention, if you're listening to this episode on Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever, listen to it. That's fine. But you might want to go to the YouTube channel, again, the Southern Outdoorsman on YouTube, and watch this because we actually have a screen recording going showing this actual study. We'll have the study linked and everything in the show notes too, but you can kind of follow along on YouTube and be able to kind of watch what we're discussing as we're going through the study.
Yeah. And this is, again, this is all about genetics, and do the genetics really play a role? Like, are you just in an area that has bad genetics? Like, are you in a club in an area that has bad genetics, or do you own land in an area, or is it the nutrition? What can you do about it? And so this is just going to be a really interesting kind of eye-opening study. And I first saw this study years ago on, I believe it was Growing Deer TV, did like a segment on it. Grant Woods did a segment on this when it first came out. I believe this is 2017. I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure this is 2017, but this is the paper, The Role of Genetics and Nutrition in Deer Management. It's got a nice little old velvet buck on there, Mississippi State. And then the people listed here are Eric Michael, Steve Damaris, Bronson Strickland, Amy Baylock, William McKinley, Chad, help me out, Dacus, and Bill Hamrick. Chad, I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, brother. Steve Damaris and Bronson Strickland, I recognize those names from the last one. They also do the Deer University podcast. So they put out a lot of good stuff. But, all right, so similar to last time, we're just going to start running through this sucker, and I got some highlights going through here to kind of hit the high points, but there's a bunch in here that I'm not going to, read through. You can go read this yourself. We're going to link it in the show notes of both the podcast and the YouTube video, so you can pull this up and go read through it yourself. It's a really easy read, and again, I said this last time, but I'll say it again. Good job to Mississippi State for putting this out in a very consumable fashion. Like anybody could read through this and get it.
Yeah.
You know, it's very, very approachable, as opposed to like if you're reading something in a scientific journal and you got to read the abstract and it's just like.
Well, we've had a study like that before.
Yeah.
That was on deer movement. A different university had done it, and I couldn't track what they were talking about for a lot of the conversation until we started pulling data off of it and actually were able to put it into, digital maps showing the points of all these deer, and that's on our Patreon. But yeah, no, this is really easy because, again, you can kind of read through it and it's very easy to consume. So,
yeah,
but
they
kind of
use a bunch of wordy words.
Yeah, but to kind of hop into it, let's roll with this. This is interesting.
So this is just kind of opening it up. Research has clearly shown that proper nutrition for whitetail deer is important in expressing genetic potential for body growth and antler size. Yearling bucks raised on a 16% protein diet grew antlers twice as large as yearlings raised on an 8% protein diet. When continued, Boone and Crockett's score at 4 years of age was 20 inches larger in the 16% protein group. The facts are clear. To produce the best quality deer, you must provide them with the opportunity to forage on the best quality plants, maintaining appropriate deer density, practicing active habitat management, and planting supplemental forages are tried and true methods of improving diet quality for deer. These actions will increase the body and antler size of the deer on your property.
I want to say something real quick. There's guys out there, they hear the protein content, 16% protein, or maybe even higher. They're like, well, dude, I'm just going to run protein pellets in my feeders. I think the problem with that is, and this is something they just mentioned, especially when it comes to like the forage and best quality plants, along with supplemental forages, which is talking about food plots here, is, again, deer aren't just grazing. They're not just eating one food source. So, like, yeah, you put supplemental, protein pellets out or something like that. Deer might nibble on them, but they're not going to consume that all day long. That's not the only thing they're eating. That's a very small portion of what they're eating. So when they're talking about like high quality forage, like when it comes to plants on your property, especially as a private landowner, having a very wide diversity of natural forage for them to feed on. And it's crazy when we've done, again, walkthroughs with like our family farm, when we had Alan Summerford and Kyle Leiber from the Native Habitat Project and Land of Legacy to come out. And they were naming off all these different plants that, like, me and Anthony knew a couple of them. I didn't know really any of them for the most part, except for like, stuff that we talk about on the podcast pretty regularly. Then they're like, dude, this right here has like 18% protein. This has 25% protein.
Yeah.
Based off, the on the plant species and stuff. This is what's helping you grow your deer. It's not just your food plots, because your food plots play a very small part in the grand scheme of things, because they're not always feeding in a food plot. Food plot's not always available versus the native browse out there. So that's a good point, being brought up very early in this study.
Yeah, definitely. It goes on to say recent research has shown that deer are more than just a product of what they eat. They're also a product of what their parents and grandparents ate. That kind of cuts to the heart of what we're about to get to. The Mississippi State University Deer Lab's latest research has discovered that deer body and antler size are also regulated by a phenomenon called epigenetics. I don't really know what that word means, to be honest with you. Let's Google it real quick. Epigenetics, basically what they're saying there, let's see here. What's the epigenetics is the study of how your behavior's environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Okay, so
You should have read that a little slower for all the audio listeners.
The study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes and affect the way your genes work. So that kind of, again, cuts to the heart of where this is going, about how the environment controls basically the genetic factors that like present themselves in a white-tailed deer. So I'm not going to try to over-explain it because they're going to get right to it. Here
I could say this from being a fat guy and losing some weight now. Listen, dude, if all you're eating is Krispy Kreme, Hunt's Brothers Pizza, and
Zaxby's,
a lot of fast food, dude, I don't care what your genetics say, you're gonna be a fat SOB. Okay, believe me, I've been there, done that. Still am, but you start eating your meats and your whole foods and everything. You start losing some weight, and you kind of start looking a little bit better. Same thing with these deer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. These deer need to be hammering some protein, just like everybody else out there. All right. So extreme regional variation. This took place in Mississippi. So essentially, what they did is they went and caught a bunch of wild deer in different parts of the state, which they classified here. We're about to get to it, and put them in captivity. Do what?
I have a question about this. After doing David Ellis's podcast, when we were talking about collared deer and stuff, I wonder what the conversation with landowners like. Did this happen on private landowners' property, or was this property that the state owned? Because as a private landowner, I don't know if I'd want somebody to come in and catch my deer, take them off.
Catching your deer. I mean, what's the difference in killing them and catching them? I mean, would you let them come out and like shoot a doe?
I'd shoot it if I keep the meat. I don't know. I'm just saying. I just thought about this. Like, I wonder where they like actually like brought the deer in from. But we'll kind of talk about the regions and everything here.
So, and a lot of people are going to be able to relate with this because there's going to be parts of your state that are, pretty much every state has a part of the state that has better soil and then bad soil. But especially these Gulf Coast states or any coastal state, there's like a coastal plain region, and then you kind of go up into some other, more diverse stuff. And this is exactly what they looked at here. So it says there's no surprise that Mississippi deer hunters, there's no surprise to Mississippi deer hunters that antler and body size differ among the state's soil regions. The Delta region tends to produce the largest bucks, whereas hunters harvest the smallest deer in the lower coastal plain, and the medium-sized deer in the thin Loess region. What is interesting is the extreme difference in body and antler sizes between the Delta and LCP. LCP is lower coastal plain, so that's going to be like that sandy soil type stuff, like poor quality soil region. Delta bucks are 41 pounds heavier and 25 inches larger in Boone and Crockett score than LCP bucks at 3 years of age. Fully understanding the causes has been a long-term quest to the Deer Lab. So there's also a map here, again, go to YouTube, that shows the Mississippi soil region. So you got the Delta area,
In
and
yellow.
then you got basically the middle, the thin Loess region. I had to look that up. The Loess is basically like a soil type that they believe is deposited by wind.
Okay.
So that's, again, a different soil type. And then you got the lower coastal plain here in blue on the map, so you can see where that is. And it's where you think it is. It's down near the Gulf Coast, that lower coastal plain is. And that's what a lot of like Florida and South Alabama, I think, would be similar habitat to that. The Delta region is home to large acreages of agriculture that provide an almost unlimited amount of high-quality forage for deer. Although a nuisance for some farmers, deer populations find an excellent summer forage supplement with soybeans, and wheat is often available during the fall and winter. In the LCP, the most common land use is timber production because of the low-quality soil in that region. Timber production can be a great source of revenue for the landowner, but how the timber is managed will have a pronounced effect on the amount of deer forage produced. Maximizing timber revenue will decrease the amount of deer forage produced. When the forest canopies are dense and do not allow sunlight to hit the ground, deer forage will disappear. So we actually talk about this all the time on the podcast because that's what we hunt most of the time.
Yeah.
We're hunting timberland, pine production kind of stuff, and there's a picture here that actually does a really good job of demonstrating what we call, or what I've called on the podcast, and in some videos we've done, like the stem exclusion phase.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is where those pine trees grow up and the canopies grow into each other and just creates like an umbrella. There's nothing reaching the forest floor. All that good cover, all the good forage underneath just kind of dies out. And those are the kind of pine trees you can just walk in between the rows and there's really nothing there. So that's like, that's people maximizing their timber revenue, but because you're crowding out the pine tree, or you're crowding the pine trees, and there's nothing that can grow underneath. You're using all the sunlight that's hitting your property to grow those pine trees. There's nothing really left for the deer or the quail or the turkeys or anything else underneath.
Yep.
So a really good picture in here that kind of shows what that actually ends up looking like.
A true plantation pines.
But also, that's a really just good thing to note about what it says. Again, like that's a pretty important statement. Maximizing timber revenue will decrease the amount of deer forage produced. So maximizing timber revenue, if you live in somewhere in the southeast and you're hunting like a lease or a hunting club, you're probably hunting a timber company's land. Mm-hmm. What is their job? Their job is to maximize timber revenue. So you can't really fault them for doing it. Like they have a responsibility. But that's why, in my opinion, it's important for us deer hunters to educate ourselves on this kind of stuff, because then we can advocate for it down the road. Like maybe there's a solution where we can, have really good timber management, but in a way that also helps us bring the quail back and helps us have larger deer densities. And I don't know what that solution is, but the more we as hunters know about it, the closer we can get to working to that solution. Because a lot of people want to throw their hands up and get mad at the timber company, which I get because it can be frustrating. But at the end of the day, it's their land and they have a financial responsibility. They have a responsibility to their shareholders to make money.
Yep. But also, this kind of goes back to if you're blessed with your own piece of private land that you own or family owns, if timber harvest is important for you, which most private landowners it is. It's figuring out a good in-between, good workaround where you're maximizing your timber harvest while still offering native browse on that property, not just food plots, not just supplemental feeding with bait or anything like that, and seeing, what potentially could you do on that property through certain thinning processes to be able, I can't talk. Yeah, I can't talk. You can't talk. But to be able to allow for, sunlight to hit the floor where you have, again, excessive amount of browse, which would be, ideal in a situation, and be able to really produce, a quality enough forage that these deer are going to be able to go out there and really showcase what they're capable of doing body weight wise. And then over, as we're hopefully going to learn through a few generations, seeing the antler and everything, antler production going up and everything else going up as well.
Yeah, for sure. Although regional differences in body and antler size of deer in Mississippi are related to soil quality and land use, we could not ignore the concern that smaller antler size in some regions was due to genetic limitations in antler potential. These concerns were supported by earlier research that differentiated two subspecies of white-tailed deer within Mississippi. I did not know this. Most of the state falls within the described range of, gosh dang it.
You good at Latin?
Why did I not look up how to say this? Odicilius virginianus.
Okay.
Virginianus. The Virginia white-tailed deer. Virginia white-tailed deer, that's what we have in Bama, a lot through Georgia, Virginia, obviously, Tennessee, Kentucky, like that's that subspecies. I didn't realize there's like 32 subspecies of whitetails. The most, like one that a lot of people know would be the Coues deer. Coues deer is a different species of whitetail or a subspecies of whitetail that lives out west. Mm-hmm. You got the key deer in South Florida. Well, that coastal plain of Mississippi is home to another one, the Virginianus osceola, because of their smaller size. So throughout Florida and that coastal plain of South Mississippi and South Alabama and Florida is Virginianus osceola. Interesting.
How many people go around tagging trying to kill these different whitetails with these different subspecies? And
I don't know.
And like mounting them on a plaque, whatever. Like I got my Virginia.
I know people.
Osceola.
I know people do that because the reason I was like, is that like a thing? So I looked it up, and one of the resources I found on the subspecies was a publication by Whitetails Unlimited that showed
your whitetail Grand Slam.
Yeah, you're like your whitetail Grand Slam, like where all the subspecies are of the ones that you can hunt. Because I don't think you can hunt key deer. But anyways,
probably can get one roadkill.
Oh, I'm sure. I'll tell you what, you can get roadkill in the Keys. It's freaking iguanas. It is wild driving around down there. Like, you're driving down the road, and then suddenly, like, a 15-pound iguana just runs out and gets smoked by a car in front of you. They're everywhere. Anyways, for example, let's say a buck's genes are coded to potentially grow antlers with a 140-inch Boone and Crockett score and a body weight of 190 pounds. But if the buck is born in an area with poor habitat quality and he consumes inadequate nutrition his entire life, he could be limited by his environment and only grow 120-inch class antlers and weigh about 150 pounds at maturity. This is a classic example of how the basic genetic model showing how the environment influences the growth of an individual. If there were an actual genetic limit to body and antler size, the improved nutrition would not allow the Osceola subspecies living in the lower coastal plain to compensate and grow as large as the Delta deer. So basically, what they're saying is all the deer that are living in the lower coastal plain, if all things are suddenly equal, they should not catch up to the Delta deer if their genetics are different.
Correct.
So if it's they also cover a lot in here about the restocking efforts and how it's kind of like a genetic mess and there's different genes kind of all over the place. So they do address that in here. We're not going to get into it, but you can go read the paper and kind of make your own.
This you didn't highlight this, but this is kind of interesting. So they released more than 3,000 deer, and some coming from as far away as Wisconsin and Mexico. Now, I've never heard Mexico. But the interesting thing is when they were talking about genetic signatures.
Oh, yeah.
That, see, where is it at? The MSU Deer Lab has confirmed that some differences in the genetic signatures of current Mississippi deer populations correspond with the restocking program. But there is no evidence that the Wisconsin deer ever contributed to the current gene pool. Now, this is something we talked about with Mark Turner, who's another research biologist, buddy of ours. And he mentioned, because in Alabama, same thing, they had deer brought in from Michigan, Wisconsin, a bunch of these different places, and that a lot of those deer, based off the genetic studies or signatures, there's no example of them still proliferating in the gene pool currently. The only one they found is in a very small portion of Alabama where there's still a slight Michigan gene supposedly there. And one thing he brought up, which is real fascinating, is because of like these deer and where they're raising these different subgroups of white-tailed deer, the deer in the southeast, because we go through a lot of drought periods, that they're more, at least this is what Mark was saying, they're more conditioned to dealing with EHD, which is spread by a flying midge, a little flying insect, where these northern strain deer are not conditioned to that. So a lot of times when you bring a northern strain deer into the southeast, it's going to die probably fairly quickly when most summers we have a certain period of drought, and if they get around any kind of water, they're going to get bit by one of those midges and probably die from it. Versus the southern deer are a little bit more accustomed to it, and you don't see these giant die-offs from EHD. And actually, side note, Blakely shot a deer this year that had evidence of EHD with the jacked up hooves. And someone else I talked to killed a deer on some public in the same general area. And had the same situation. So it's like a lot of these southern deer.
We got a moth flying around here.
It seems like a lot of these southern deer, again, can get through that where these northern strains can't. And that was the whole thing about the restocking effort. So there's a very good chance a lot of these deer that were brought down from, far north of the United States or in the United States, when they brought down here, they might have lived for a year or two before they got killed by EHD.
Yeah. So they didn't live on and pass on their giant Michigan buck genes all over the place. Which, again, it's like one of my favorite things is when we go to these trade shows talking to people from Michigan. Because people from Michigan complain about hunting in Michigan. Because it's a tough state. There's a lot of pressure there.
Oh, yeah.
And they talk about how awful it is. And I'm like, dude, in Alabama, people are like, I found that Michigan strain on my property. I'm like, it's like the promised land,
Yeah.
So, anyways, the grass is always greener on the other side, folks. So, on this page, they've got another map of Mississippi. Again, that shows you the different soil regions. So your Delta, the thin Loess, which the thin Loess region, again, is like kind of that middle ground. Like it's not terrible soil, but it's not great soil. And then the lower coastal plain. And it also has little black dots showing you where all the deer were collected from. So it's a pretty wide range of properties that they collected deer from. So pretty interesting. And on here they say, we hypothesize that if we fed all of these deer a highly nutritious diet, but their body and antler size remain different, then we could conclude that the regional variation is caused by genetic limitations. However, if deer with genetic backgrounds from regions with historically smaller body and antler size compensated and caught up to the bigger Delta deer when fed the same high-quality diet, we can conclude that nutrition is the ultimate cause of regional variation. So, again, they kind of lay out their case here. That's their hypothesis that they're going into this with. And, again, to lay it out, they caught all these deer. So these are pregnant does that they're catching on these properties. So they go out and I guess they dart them. I don't know exactly how they caught them, but a bunch of pregnant does. They catch them, bring them to their facility, their captive facility, and let them go. All these does give birth to fawns, and so they're and then once they're weaned, all the fawns are fed the exact same diet. So the mother's removed from the picture, and all of them are fed the same diet, and they track that. So that's the first generation. And then they let those does have fawns, and then they track the second generation.
And they're using the breeding for the other deer that same generation in that pen.
Yeah.
So presumably you're going to have bucks and does being born.
Yes.
And then as that generation gets to breeding age, those fawns, now you're going to half-year-old deer, probably 2-year-old deer, are breeding, and then so on and so on.
Yeah, so basically the wild deer ends up being the grandparent, and they look at the offspring of the wild deer and then the offspring of the wild deer's offspring. So they're looking at 2 generations. Okay?
But breeding them in their pens that are designated, again, delta deer in one area, thin lotus are in one area, and then the lower coastal plains are in a different pen.
Yeah, so they're not intermixing these at all.
Yep.
So again, the genetics are all completely separate and stable. Wild-caught mothers gave birth to their fawns at the MSU Deer Lab captive facility. After the fawns were weaned, the fawns all ate the same high-quality diet, and their mothers were removed from the study. So unlike their mothers, the first generation of captive-raised Delta, Thin Loess, and lower coastal plain fawns all received the same high-quality diet. Each fall, we measured body weight and antler size for regional comparison. So it's got a picture of a dude measuring a pretty nice buck right there in the captive facility. All right, first generation results. They got some charts. This is where you need to go to YouTube, baby. And if you're already on YouTube, good job.
We appreciate you.
So they compare body weight at 3 years and antler score at 3 years. And I'm going to read this, then we're going to kind of look at this chart. Being raised on an optimum nutrition caused a moderate increase in growth of first-generation bucks compared to their wild predecessors. Over all 3 regions, body and antler size increased about 6%, but the pattern was not consistent among regions. Body weight for 3-year-old bucks from the Delta and Thin Loess increased by 9 pounds, but lower coastal plain bucks remained essentially unchanged compared to their wild counterparts, roaming the nutritionally deprived region of South Mississippi.
God bless those people.
God bless them. Antler score was a different story. Bucks from the Delta remained essentially unchanged, whereas Thin Loess and LCP bucks, lower coastal plain bucks, increased 7 inches more than their wild predecessors. Okay, so then we look at the graphs, and yeah, so this is pretty interesting. The lower coastal plain, so again, the worst area of this study, pretty much remained the same as far as body weight. Their body weight is a +1 on the, so you have like on this graph, the yellow is wild, the blue says F1, so that's the first generation, and yeah, it's just +1 on the body weight.
So 1 pound.
So no change. I guess that's probably within whatever margin of error they might have. But their antlers did get bigger, so that I found that kind of interesting. And also on the Delta, their antlers got smaller, so that's interesting.
They didn't have no soybeans in there.
That's right.
Your buddy from your club, man, he's like planting soybeans.
You can hear him now. I ought to send him this. So that's again first generation results. That's pretty interesting. What is your thoughts on that? I mean, because that would, if you're just looking at the first generation, that would seem to support the whole genetic thing. Like, these genetics just suck. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, especially when you look at the antler. Well, we look at the body weight, it's still incredibly different. I mean, your Delta deer, that first generation's, pushing 190-ish plus pounds, maybe a little bit higher than that, where the lower coastal plain deer, again, increased by roughly an average of 1 pound, and they're like 140 something pounds at 3 years old. Mm-hmm. Which again, that's a huge difference. And it kind of goes back to like some of the areas that we've hunted in Alabama, where you go to like some areas and you're seeing guys kill 230-pound bucks.
Yeah.
Not all the time, but like you'll see deer like that come from like one region of the state.
It's not unheard of.
And then if you literally drive 2 hours, or not even that far, an hour in a different direction, like the average mature buck might be 160 pounds.
Yep.
And it's like, so that's, it's kind of fascinating, but it's also kind of fascinating because you would think, again, I think the average person, think about this, if they were fed super high quality diet that very first year, you would see an increase. Or, if they were fed from birth after they were weaned off a super high quality diet that you'd see a big difference in that first generation, but there's really not, especially when you're talking about body weights. Antlers, and you plus 7 inches, that's pretty cool. Taking a deer from, sub Boone and or not Boone and Crockett, sub Pope and Young to, almost getting to Pope and Young, but they're not, I mean, they're still not quite there. But it's kind of crazy if you look at this, the lowest hill or the thin lowest, those deer right there at 3 years old outperformed the Delta deer at 3 years old, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'd be curious to ask about that.
Yeah, because
that's why we need to go to Mississippi State.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interview those cats.
But again, the lower coastal plains is still way down on the totem pole, which is again just kind of fascinating. I mean, you're looking at it's 111, 112 inches for the thin lowest, and the Delta deer is probably 108 maybe inches, and then your lower coastal plains is sitting around
it's probably like 98 inches.
Yeah, like
something like that.
Mid 90s. So, anyways, it's again kind of goes back to you see guys in the Midwest killing 130-inch deer at 3 years old, and all these there's not a single deer over 112 on this at 3 years old.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I'll note something here that they said earlier. This is going to come in later in this study, I guess. But one thing that they pointed out that I found interesting when they were talking about nutrition and habitat, they also talked about like having a proper deer density, so not having too many deer. And you brought this up last week when we were talking with guys like Alan Summerford, Adam and Matt. Dang, I did what you did from Land and Legacy, talking about how a lot of people don't shoot enough does, and a lot of these Midwestern states don't really necessarily have that problem, or at least like the cream of the crop. Because he was saying that Iowa used to have a lower deer density
and bigger deer,
and now Iowa's going downhill a little bit because everyone quit shooting does.
Well, it's the same thing. So and I was talking to one of those fellers, and we were actually discussing that because he said there's some very big name people that have sold their farms in Illinois in like mid 2017, 2018. Deer numbers got so high that there were so many deer, like it was hard to kill enough of them.
Yeah,
because it's not like you have unlimited doe tags and stuff like you do in Alabama. Mississippi, you can only kill 5 does.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So Alabama's the Wild West. Tennessee's the Wild West too. There's part of Tennessee you kill 3 does a day in Tennessee for the whole season. But anyways, that happened in Illinois where they saw like some of these people were selling their farms because they couldn't keep growing enough, big enough deer, because there were so many deer there. Moved to Iowa. And now Iowa's seeing that, which is kind of crazy for us Southerners to think, if you're listening to this podcast, like Iowa's kind of going down here. There's still like really big deer there. But relatively speaking, compared to like 10, 15 years ago, these guys who manage properties up there, like they're seeing a big issue where there's now so many deer, not enough people are shooting does that it's hard to compete with that many mouths and producing enough food for them.
Yeah.
And what's funny is, anybody's interested, what they told me is some of those guys are selling their farms there and they're moving to Indiana. Because Indiana and parts of Indiana still have low deer numbers, but they have, again, the quality to grow some huge deer. In the last few years, we've seen some gigantic bucks come from Indiana. So that's the new state that's probably going to pop off the next couple of years.
And then we're going to ruin that one, too.
well, yeah, because, again, people, I think that's something that's interesting in some of these states, and that's something that they were talking about with me is, when you get to a state where it's like only big bucks, people are scared to shoot does. Yeah. And it's like kind of one of those things like, oh, I don't want to kill a doe, whether it's like, she might carry that genetic to grow really big deer, or, I don't want to ruin a spot because there's some 180, 190-inch deer running around, 200-inch deer. Where
hard to fault them for that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, if you're hunting a 190-inch deer, like, are you going to wax the first doe that walks out?
Yeah. So that's kind of the issue. But you go to one of these areas that has lower deer numbers, like just a smaller deer herd, but they have, again, as we'll learn maybe a little bit more about kind of the genetics, the nutritional aspect and everything, to grow really large deer, that's the next hot spot to be able to find, super large deer. Because if you can really make high quality food source abundant on some big properties, you could then in turn, again, if it's a large enough property where you don't have to worry about neighbors necessarily killing it, which, the average guy like us, I can't go buy 4,000 acres. Okay. But if you got a lot of money and, you can buy and lease a bunch of area all in one continuous block, you could potentially make a difference where a deer might not leave that property other than a very short window of time. So he might be able to get 6+ years old and be able to express his full potential. And then after, 4 or 5 years, you might be growing 200+ inch deer.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting stuff. All right, now we're getting to the meat and taters of this whole thing.
Second generation.
All right, so I'm going to read some of this, and then we're going to hit these charts. The second generation was composed of deer born to mothers raised in our research pens on the optimal high-quality diet. That is, they're the offspring of the first generation deer. Remember, the first generation deer were all raised on the same high-quality diet, but their mothers were raised in the wild. We saw significant increases in the second generation.
With an exclamation point.
Yeah, they're excited about it. Results in Figure 5 show that bucks from the Delta, Thin Loess, and lower coastal plain regions increased 32, 21, and 36 pounds respectively compared to the wild bucks from their respective regions. That's a whopping 18% improvement. Another exclamation mark. They're fired up. This second generation lower coastal plain bucks grew body weights equivalent to the wild bucks from the Delta region. Antler size displayed the same trend. Bucks from the Delta, Thin Loess, and lower coastal plain regions increased 5, 11, and 28 inches, respectively, compared to the wild bucks. The 28 inches for the lower coastal plain bucks was an amazing 32% improvement compared to their wild predecessors. Dude, look at that. Look at that graph. That is freaking crazy.
That's insane. So again,
now,
hopefully you're on YouTube by this point, guys.
Yeah.
You know, and watching this and looking at these charts. This is fascinating. Now, the body weights still aren't, comparable. Okay. Now,
well, you say that, but okay, if you look at the original Delta deer, right? So the original Delta deer, it has the body weight. The wild deer was at
185,
190. By the time that second generation comes around, the lower coastal plain deer is about even with that Delta deer. So in my opinion, it would stand to reason, and they actually get to this here in a minute, that if you were to keep going after the third, fourth generation, it's going to keep catching up to the body weight. So like now the body weight of the Delta deer on this graph is about 220. Again, it started about 185. Now it's 220. Whereas the lower coastal plain deer started at about 140, 145, and now it's at about 180. So again, they made up that difference from the Delta deer. And then same thing with the antler growth. So the antler growth actually exceeded the original average score of the Delta deer, which is really interesting.
That is awesome. Holy crap.
That's crazy, dude.
That is insane.
That's actually really crazy.
To me, that's where you see the biggest similarity between the Delta deer, the Thin Loess, and the lower coastal plains is on antlers. Antler size at 3 years old. They're almost, spitting images of each other.
Oh, dude, they're right there. They're dead even across the top. Just about.
They're close. Deltas. An inch
a
or
little
two
bit bigger.
But it's like they're across the board. So much bigger. And then again, the one you see the biggest jump from on both charts is the lower coastal plains. 36 pounds heavier at 3 years old compared to like their wild counterpart. And then at 3 years old, they're 28 inches bigger than their wild counterpart.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
Yeah. That is so impressive, man. And that should give people hope if you're managing a property and you're implementing habitat changes. It shouldn't take that long to start seeing results,
especially if you can, going back to the abundance of food, just like what we're doing on the family farm. So Anthony has seen this with does specifically, bucks as well, but especially with does. And we talked about this in past podcast episodes about our family farm that my uncle Anthony runs and has owned for years now. He came through. They did a big select cut on that property about 10 years ago. It grew back up as thick pines. They were just regenerated pines. He went through and mulched. Took a mulch head actually a brush head. It wasn't a mulch head. It was a brush head on a skid steer and cleared everything. Yep. Okay. To the point where now it looks like prairie. Okay.
Yep.
Now the thing is, this is something I kind of talked to him this year. I kind of want to do a little update with him on it. The abundance of food went through the roof. What dropped was the cover. Okay. So he had more deer, and then we also burned part of the property that they traditionally had bedded a whole bunch in. The thing is, since when he started mulching this property about 3 years ago when he first mulched it, he saw within a couple years like just the body weights of does. Like he was killing does. Like typically you'd kill does, like a big doe is 90 pounds.
Yeah,
I think he's killed two does that were in 120 pound range. And he's seen some bigger. He's seen deer that big or bigger on trail camera that he just hasn't been able to kill. But in addition to that, he doesn't know. And we talked about this. I don't know if it attracted higher quality bucks, but since he started doing some of that work starting about 4 years ago, there's been bigger and bigger deer showing up on camera that he had never seen.
Yeah.
And what Alan and Kyle talked about is it might have just like some of those deer are already in the area, but because you have such a high quality food and everything else around you is like closed canopy or maybe lightly thin pines,
you just sucked them all in.
You sucked them all in, which is a 2-part issue. Part of it's great because they're there, but the other part is they're eating all your food, so that means you need to manage even harder. Especially your does, and take more does off the property, limit as many mouths are on the property. But, I mean, that's when he killed Hightower. Hightower had been living on that property. That deer was 13 and a half inches wide. Official score was 139 and 2/8 or 6/8, I think.
Yeah, he's
as an 8-point, just a huge deer, crazy mass on that deer. And he blew up. That last year and a half that he was on that, but really last year he's on that property when a lot of that work had been done, and he was able to kill that deer. And after that, he started showing me photos he had never showed me of these 140 plus inch deer running around the property. That one of his neighbors killed one, and that was something that Alan and Kyle both talked about. From a small property owner, you're doing a lot of this work, but like you really need to get your neighbors on board and kind of like what you're trying to manage for, and get them kind of bought in on the project. Because the thing is, your neighbors could reap some rewards of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And like his neighbor, who's got like a very small acreage, doesn't do anything with the acreage, with his property. He killed a giant 10-point on that place.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It was that 140 plus inch 10-point that Anthony had on camera, and he was using Anthony's property a whole bunch. But he was mostly feeding and kind of bedding in there. But during the rut, that guy coming through the property, which is fine. Again, it was mature deer, really nice deer, really big deer. And it kind of goes back to like, if you can get everybody on board of like what you're doing and kind of start seeing some success of the body weight changes, and even maybe start seeing some antler changes after 4 or 5 years, something like that. You're talking 3-4 generations. It might get them a little more excited to be like, okay, let's do some work on my property now.
Yeah.
And see what could be done.
Yeah, definitely. All right. For logistical reasons, we had to end the study when the bucks were 3 years old, but that's not the end of the results. We were able to predict antler size at maturity based on growth rates from our other studies. The average antler size at 3 years of age for a first-generation lower coastal plain buck was 95 inches. Using this score as a basis for our prediction, first-generation lower coastal plain bucks would score at about 122 at 6 years of age. So, again, they're estimating based on their studies that that deer that at 3.5 is 95 inches. At 6.5, he'll probably be about 122 inches. This means that after one generation of improved nutrition, lower coastal plain bucks are almost reaching the minimum requirements to be entered into the Pope and Young record books, a 125-inch minimum. The average antler score of the second generation bucks was 116 inches. Again, this is using this score as a basis for our prediction. The second generation lower coastal plain bucks would score about 147 inches at 6 years of age. You went from a 95-inch deer to a 150. Okay, like that's really impressive to me. So that's what I'm talking about, where I'm saying that like these changes that you implement, it's going to take time, but it's not like it's going to take 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it kind of goes back to all these trophy clubs.
Yeah.
If you could have a trophy club, but if you can't manage the timber on that club and it's not managed in the correct way, it's not. I mean,
yeah,
you'll have older age class deer, but it's not going to be able to express their full potential because of the food source limitations.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk more about that here in just a minute. You are what you eat, but you're also what your mother and her mother ate. Our results clearly show that deer in the lower coastal plain region of Mississippi are not genetically doomed to have smaller bodies and antlers. They are simply a product of their environment. Once nutrition was improved, lower coastal plain bucks started to display their genetic potential, but it took time. We feel confident that what we found was an epigenetic effect. This new epigenetic phenomenon explains how one's DNA can remain the same while its expression is altered by environmental conditions. One way to think about it is a series of switches within an animal's genes. If generations of family have lived in a low-quality habitat, then it's advantageous to turn off the switch, quote-unquote, for the genes that promote a large body and antlers. The advantage is that smaller animals are better suited to the quality of forage in their environment. Yes?
You know, one thing I wish they would have predicted as well, not just antlers, but what the body size could have been.
Oh, yeah, I wish they... Oh, they might have... No, I don't think they did that.
That's something I would love to figure out. Because at 3 years old, these Delta deer are 220 pounds.
At 3?
Dude.
At 3.
Dude. We're talking like some probably 270s running around, which you do see that every now and then. So you'll see guys in like Delta region of Mississippi, also like parts of Louisiana, like eastern Louisiana, and also that southern Arkansas, that you'll see people that will kill a deer, put it on a scale, and live weight's 270, 280 pounds. I've heard of some almost breaking a 300-pound mark.
That is, I can't even imagine. I don't even know what a deer that big would look like. I can't imagine that.
I know what my Iowa deer looked like, but also those deer are bigger skeletal structure. I can't imagine that these deer down here, our deer in the southeast, at least in my experience, 3 to 5 inches shorter, and then like height wise, and then length wise, at least that much, if not a little bit more than that. I mean, dude, you talk about as Travis Murray said, a bull yearling.
Bull yearling.
That's what it was like. I mean, he's just like this dude. Looks like he's been hitting some corn piles, but also the weight rack.
Yeah, that's right. It says this off switch, quote unquote, keeps animals from growing larger in a particularly good year, only to be hurt when forage quality returns to normal. Therefore, this new epigenetics model shows that in addition to the environment a buck experiences during his lifetime, the habitat quality experienced by his parents and grandparents is also critically important. So again, that's just, putting it in layman's terms, like that's just saying that, again, flipping a switch. It's advantageous for them if they live in a really poor quality region where there's not much food. It's better for them to be smaller. It takes less food for them to live, I guess, if they're smaller.
Absolutely,
and also, it takes less resources to throw a 120-inch or a 95-inch rack as opposed to a 140-inch rack.
Does it talk about? Well, by the way, that 95-inch rack, that's for a 3-year-old.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's clarifying. But one thing I don't know if it mentions in here, and you can tell me, is like the stress of like poor soil, poor browse, variation for a deer. If you have high deer numbers in that area as well, that's even less food for them to eat, less quality food. Mm-hmm. So like it's like a double whammy versus like an area like, again, like some of the Delta deer living in large agriculture areas, for that example. Yeah, there might be a lot of deer, but if you have thousands of acres, now it's only during certain times of the month or year when there's, cover crop, and then also, soybeans, corn, all that kind of stuff that's planted, cotton too. But there's more abundance in like large scale for them to feed at, even though that they're browsing, compared to like in an area where it's high deer numbers, closed canopy forest, there's a lot less for them to eat. And again, you start seeing those smaller bodies, and like that stress of like a mother, a female doe. I almost said female doe. I know there's a male doe, but I don't know if they identify that way. I have to ask them. But again, like the stress of those females being able to put on enough body weight in order to give, their body enough fat in order to produce milk and everything, is extremely stressful. And that's what it seems like as well on this, is that, once they kind of get over the stress of not having enough food and quality food,
yes,
it's like they can do what their, their genetic traits are built for.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That's awesome.
Another interesting paragraph that kind of explains it. Although the first generation of bucks were raised on the same optimal diet, certain genes that code for growth were not, quote-unquote, switched on. Their mothers had passed along a signal to their genes that essentially said, don't grow as big as you can because the environment simply won't support it. That's a disadvantage to being too big when food is limited. However, by the second generation, these genetic switches were turning on and signaling to the genes that it is now safe to grow larger because the mothers had good nutrition. This can be thought of as the mother inheriting her environment. If a mother inherits a high-quality environment, then she will pass that along to her fawns, and the same will occur if she inherits a low-quality environment. So this is really interesting too, because we're kind of focusing on the lower coastal plain being, a lot of people who hunt there probably just talk about how they have bad genetics, when in reality it's the habitat and nutrition. But here's an interesting paragraph too that looks at the other end of the spectrum. The deer in the Delta region exhibited a second important genetic result. We considered our Delta deer to be the gold standard for body and antler growth by white-tailed deer in Mississippi, yet we observed a 32-pound increase in body weight and a 5-inch increase in antler score. These results prove that even deer in the Delta are not attaining their full potential in the wild and could benefit from improved habitat quality. So I love that they threw that in there, because even the cream of the crop down here in the Mississippi Delta is not hitting its full potential. There's still, if you live in the Delta, you can still increase your body weights by 32 pounds. Like, that's super impressive.
There's a lot more meat in the freezer.
That's a lot more meat in the freezer. That's exactly right.
You know what? They didn't track this either. I wonder how the does performed. Like how much bigger body weight the does got year over year. I know they were just looking at buck size.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious, like, did your does go from, like, say the delta maybe 120 pounds? You started having 140, 150 pound does running around?
Let's go ask them.
That'd be very interesting as well. I know some people don't get excited about that, but, you know, that'd be kind of an
Hey,
interesting
filling that
point.
freezer, boy. All right, these are their 3 main takeaways. I'm just going to read them off. Number 1, stop worrying about genetics. Although genetics do control body and antler growth of individuals, they are not the cause of regional variation in body and antler size. Besides that, our other research has provided that genetics cannot be managed in free-ranging populations.
No colon deer.
No colon deer. Number 2, focus on nutrition. These results are empowering because they show a clear link between body and antler quality and nutrition, which is something you can improve on your property. Habitat management and supplemental food plots will yield results. And number 3, be realistic about expectations because big changes take time. We live in a society where everything is at our fingertips. If we want it now, we can have it now. The mindset should not be carried into our deer management. Although individual deer will respond to increased nutrition in the short term, it will take 5 to 10 years of consistently improved nutrition for the genetic switches, quote unquote, to be turned on and stimulate greater expansion and stimulate greater expression of their genetic potential. Once turned on, you will see far greater improvements on the population level. So all great points there. You know, it's going to take 5 to 10 years, and you might see individual improvements, but it's going to take longer, which actually gets me really excited about a lot of places that we hunt around Alabama, whether it just be some WMAs like the state, and at least here in Alabama, the state leased a lot of WMAs in the past, and a lot of those are going away because it's a lease, and that's perishable.
Yeah.
The state doesn't own that lease. So we've lost a lot of WMA land in the last 10 to 15 years. But they are replacing it. They're buying stuff with Forever Wild. They have bought some management areas. A lot of the stuff they're buying is going to SOAs, which people have mixed opinions about, myself included. But on those WMAs that they own, they're implementing a lot of the things that these studies are talking about. They're cutting timber, they're burning, they're doing food plots and everything. Like they're going the whole 9 yards. And a lot of that has only been going on for a couple years now. So we're not really seeing the full effect of that. So that kind of excites me for not only, first of all, some of the SOAs that we've hunted and seen what they produce right now, where they literally, like one of them, they had just cut this terrible timber all over this place, and they had cut it like the year before we hunted there. And that's when I killed that 10-point I held up earlier. So I'm like, and we saw what was walking around in there. So I'm like, what's that place going to be like in 10 years?
Or 5 years.
Bro. Along with some WMAs that we hunt too, where they manage out there. So really excited to see that. What are your thoughts?
I'll say this, as a landowner, this would get me so excited. Especially if you had some acreage you could work with, whether it's 50 acres, 100 acres, 500 acres, 1,000 acres, whatever, of like things that you could do. And also another great reason to have some really good neighbors and build good relationships with them, where you can have, as Adam and Keith talk about, or Adam and Matt. Sorry, guys.
Adam, Keith, and Matt.
Yeah.
We always call them Adam and Keith.
Yeah. Sorry, Matt. But what those guys have talked about, like building a good neighborhood around your property where like everybody's on the same page. Like it's one thing if you own 100 acres, but if you can get all the landowners around you, that kind of touch you, and maybe it's 2,000 acres, all on the same page and kind of doing some similar stuff, y'all all can benefit the reward of doing work like this on your property. Again, doing some food plots and stuff, but really focus on the habitat and what can be done to allow more sunlight to hit the ground, more of the native browse to pop up, to give the deer much more abundance of food source for them, and then see how that progresses. And then also coming together with a management strategy. Try to see if there's something y'all can do, management strategy, trying to allow some of your deer to kind of get to maturity and see what they're capable of doing. To me, that gets me really excited, even though I don't own any property, but like for people that do, trying to focus on something like that, you could have like some huge benefits, especially if you're not in an area that has super high quality deer right now when it comes to like antler size and body size of deer. But also if you do live in an area like that, it could get better. That's what the study shows. It
Yeah.
can get better. You
Yeah.
might think you're in the cream of the crop. Well, it can get better than that just with a little bit of work and some thought process put behind it.
100%. Also on here, I want to show that, earlier we looked at the pine plantation that was the stem exclusion phase. It was shaded out, terrible, awful, no forage for deer. Here's a picture that is the antithesis of that. This is a thinned pine stand. When we talk about thinned pines, this is what we're talking about. It's this picture right here. Again, if you're not watching on YouTube, go to YouTube and you'll be able to see it. But you can see that if you look up at the canopies of the trees, they're not touching. There's plenty of room between all these trees. And if you look at the understory, there's just all kinds of stuff growing.
Goldenrod right there
Yeah,
growing.
there's some goldenrod growing. There's looks like some greenbrier possibly down in here, maybe ragweed. And then, of course, there's some saplings growing up, maybe sweet gums or something.
But it shows in the photo above it, again, running a fire through it
Mm-hmm.
and getting everything on a rotation. So every few years, you get back to that stage. Because if not, in the Southeast, we have very long growing seasons. Same thing that we experience at the farm. When you go through and clear cut and you don't manage it right after that clear cut, it becomes a jungle, which has thick cover. But the problem is it's thick without not a lot. There's not a lot of food. There's not a lot of understory underneath it. So again, there's deer that bed on it, but they're leaving that property to go feed
Yeah.
on other places because there's nothing there, especially if oaks aren't dropping. Versus this example here, when you're rotating stuff through fire and you keep it during that stage, that early successional habitat, there's an abundance of cover and food on that property, and you do it in a checkerboard effect, which a lot of these land managers talk about. So at every stage of the year, there's something where there's, again, thicker cover. Three years since it's been a burn. There's some small saplings grow up in it. You have a lot thicker cover. You have the stuff that's 2 years old that you have, chest high, grasses, forbs growing up in it. And then you have the fresh burn, that open area that, again, is going to have very young growth after that burn's gone through. Like Anthony at the farm, I talked to him about 4 or 5 weeks after we did the fire, or we did the burn down there, and it started raining, and he's like, the whole property, like everything we burned looks like a food plot. It's just green shoots like 5 inches long, and the deer are mowing it down.
Yeah.
So it's like you have, like, again, the checkerboard effect, and that's what we're about to do. Is another fire on a different portion that hasn't been burned yet. They kind of get back into a rhythm where we start doing smaller sections going back and forth every year. So we have, like, the variety on a property.
Yeah, definitely. And again, going back to, a lot of people don't own their own land, but maybe if you're in a hunting club or something, just depends on who owns it. And I'm just thinking out loud here because, if you don't own it and you can't manage the timber, you're kind of SOL. But, a lot of timber companies come in and do thinnings. Like Westervelt on our club has come in and they've done thinnings in several parts. But after they thin it, they don't really do anything with it. They all the saplings grow up and it kind of goes through, a cycle, and it's good for a little bit and then it kind of gets crappy.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's worth asking the forester or the property manager, hey, like, what if the club paid for a prescribed fire? What if we paid to have you out here, have like someone who's like certified, like a what do they call it, like a burn master or something like that, who has like that certification to come out and oversee it. It's not expensive to go burn something. It's, as far as land management goes, it's pretty cheap. But like, I think about my club, and we had the conversation on Thursday about the guy who's wanting to plant bean fields. I would much rather just go burn some pines on the property than plant food plots.
Well, especially the pines that's been select cut. If
Yeah,
it's closed canopy, it's not going to do anything. But if it's, again, the select cut pines, saplings grow up, like the spot I was hunting the last day of season, you ran a fire through that, it would be primo. Not only for deer, for turkeys too. And
Yes.
also quail would benefit. So yeah, that's 100% right. And that would be an interesting conversation. It'd be interesting to maybe interview somebody from Westervelt.
Yeah.
And get their take on, like, is it a broad scheme, or is it the same scheme across the board that they do with every property, or do they have some variety that they can do based off the different locations of some properties? Because some properties,
Yeah.
I know they can't burn. Say you get a gas line or something like that. Well, that's a fire hazard, explosion hazard, high line, power line, stuff like that. Like, make sure nothing gets out of control. But like on other properties that doesn't have anything that could necessarily get damaged or destroyed, when it comes to like the timber value,
Yeah.
running fires through it, and it, again, benefit the timber harvest. I mean, that's something that y'all learned at Auburn University, not University of Auburn.
Yeah.
Anyways, with the forestry school, like how it helps with timber production, but also how it can help so much with the wildlife. And again, happier leasees, and they're killing more deer, they're happy to keep on paying you to keep that lease.
Yeah.
And so on.
Well, and it'd be interesting too because again, you don't know till you ask. Like maybe there's some liability stuff that you'd have to work through there. Maybe you could get some kind of liability insurance to cover the timber company because obviously with the timber company they don't want some unexperienced people doing a prescribed burn because if all of a sudden you burn it too hot and you kill all those trees, well, they just lost a ton of money
Yeah.
and a lot of time. So you'd have to address that. But again, this is why I think it's important for us as hunters to learn about this kind of stuff because you can at least open a dialogue about it, and you can ask the timber company or the property manager, what are you okay with?
And being a lot more informed about it too.
Yes.
Like after like a study like this, like you could bring this up and again, it'd be worth, because again, I haven't been in a lease or a hunting club like that. I don't know how the structure is with the timber company and like who a contact would be.
Yeah.
But like if you could set up a meeting or something and kind of go over, like show them this study as an example of like, we would love to do more on the property in order to, have better quality habitat for all the wildlife on the property.
Yeah.
Is there a way we can work together on doing some of this stuff? Like if you're gonna be thinning 2 years after the thin, could we come through, could you either you guys come out and burn? Could we get somebody from like an Alabama Forestry, what's the organization?
Alabama Forestry Association or something like that?
Something like that. Because they do fires too. Like the Anthony was
Yeah.
trying to get them to come out and they'll do it for free. Like if you get the permit and everything, they'll come out and actually do the fire. I believe. I think I'm saying that correctly. Because
We'll have to talk to someone from there, maybe.
yeah. By the way, that moss on you.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, really, really interesting points. But what's this? What's this right here?
It just says shady forests provide very little forage for deer, so work with a registered forester to thin timber stands as soon as possible. Apply herbicides to control woody vegetation, and finally, incorporate a prescribed burning program. Many hunters do a good job of planning cool season food plots, but few developed a good warm season program. Keep in mind that both antlers and fawns are being grown during summer, so this is a critical time for deer to have good nutrition and to switch those growth genes on. And another thing I'll just say about this as well, if you're in the South and you're hunting a timber company land or something, especially these large timber companies, Westervelt, Weyerhaeuser, Manulife, there's a couple others. A lot of times they own like big chunks of land. Like where my club is, Westervelt owns probably 8,000 plus acres right there, and it's several different clubs. So if I was able to approach Westervelt per se, again, just thinking out loud, I don't know how realistic this is, but if I were able to approach them and say, hey, can we do like if the club pays for it, if we as members, tack on a little extra to our membership fee and we get money in the pot, can we do a prescribed fire with your permission, obviously approved by the timber company? Could we do herbicide treatments? Could we do something simple like a hack and squirt treatment, even something as simple as that for timber stand improvement? Again, getting approval from you guys. And if they said yes, and then I could go to the club across the street and say, hey, we got permission from Westerville to do this. Would you guys be interested in kind of co-oping and doing some of this on your property as well? Well, then all of a sudden I go from having 1,800 acres that we get a little bit of freedom to do this stuff on to now it's like 6,000 acres continuous.
You get it approved on the other club.
Yeah, you get it approved on the other club, and that's how these co-ops work. And then all of a sudden you're making a real difference because especially we keep mentioning quail because, upland hunting in the South is me and Nick Adair from Gundog It Yourself were talking about how it is no longer
a tradition.
It's no longer a culture; it's a tradition because it doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. People don't do it anymore, so we don't have like a bird dog culture down here anymore because there's no birds to hunt. We have a tradition. Everyone's like, "Yeah, my grandpa used to do it," or now we both have gun dogs and we got to drive several hours to go hunt quail. And a lot of what we end up talking about is directed at public land. We're like, oh, why don't they burn this WMA? Why don't we do this? Well, we're not going to bring back quail, and we're not going to improve turkey numbers by doing that on public land.
Yeah, like it's 3%
It's
or
3%
less.
of the state. Like it's a non-factor. It's private land management that's going to do it. And so we as hunters, this is what I'm talking about. We need to create some kind of dialogue and figure out solutions because if you get a bunch of hunting clubs doing this kind of thing, that will move the needle.
Yeah.
If all of a sudden you have 6,000 acres 8,000 acres of several different landowners who are really working to do this and doing it right, well, that'll have a big change on that area, and you kind of have that throughout the state. That will move the needle, so that kind of excites me about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I'd like to reach out to somebody from the timber company and just I don't know. Just ask some questions. Like, why don't people do that? I don't know if it's because that'd just be a hard no from the timber company. I'm sure with some timber companies that for sure would be a hard no. But again, you don't know till you ask. I think that it might be that probably like no one asks because the majority of people that you talk to in the club are a lot more concerned about corn, protein pellets, and soybeans than they are the habitat.
Yeah.
And just to go back, like it does say those warm season food plots can have an impact, but
That's fine, but if you're in a closed canopy forest, it's still not moving the needle.
yeah, like that's kind of the ice cream, I feel like. Which I would really like to ask the researchers about that directly and say, you're talking about warm season food plots. If I've got this like kind of terrible club that doesn't have great forage quality, the habitat kind of sucks, is it really going to do that much if I spend this extra time and money to plant like a super high quality, like if I go out and plant a bunch of soybeans wherever I can plant soybeans, or is that more of a tool for people who have good habitat and they're just trying to get that extra 30 pounds? Like we saw with the Mississippi Delta region, they've already got pretty good deer, but they can still do better. Is that more of a tool for them, or can I use that tool and have it be worth my while?
Yeah.
You know?
But also, I think it comes down to the acreage. How many acres can you plant?
Yeah, that's very
Because
true.
if, like, on your club, it might equal out to 12 acres maybe total
Yeah.
on 1,800 acres that you
Yeah.
could plant. And I'm like, is that going to move the needle enough?
No. I don't think so.
Yeah. So, again.
I don't pass the eyeball test.
But no, I think the big thing is, and this is a really good point with this study, is the more well-informed and educated deer hunters there are out there that think through the lens of like a land manager, even if you're hunting public land, you get enough people to kind of voice your opinion on what ought to be done, especially on, whatever state you're in, be able to go to, board of directors at the DCNR, your DNR or whatever, and kind of bring up, what you'd like to be seen done with kind of the habitat when it comes to funding, but also from a private landowner or, someone that's leasing property or on a hunting club, the more informed, educated hunters looking through the lens of a land manager, which is kind of where this falls under, I think more of the needle could be moved.
Yeah.
Because if everybody's out there still with the mindset like I gotta run corn, I gotta feed them with corn or something like that, or put in my small little food plots and not worry anything about the habitat, nothing's ever gonna change.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, super interesting food for thought there. And, guys, share this episode with your buddies who maybe you're looking at getting a lease with, or maybe your buddy who's in the hunting club next to you, or whatever the case may be.
I'll tell you something interesting.
Uh-huh.
So we're going to talk about leases real quick. Like Andrew had mentioned, a lot of leases in the Deep South are typically going to be through timber companies, but you can still find leases. If you find a landowner, and one of my uncles have done this, Anthony's brother, Michael, has done this, where he leased property directly through a landowner who does not use the property, doesn't even live in the state, doesn't even live in Alabama. She actually lives in California. And he leases the property, and she gives him full, like, he has a check with her, but he can do whatever with the property as long as she approves it. Okay. And they came through and clear cut that property. It's 200 something acres. They clear cut a lot of SMZs and stuff. She let them bring in a D9 dozer and then actually open up all the ridge tops on there and be able to put very large food plots in, good road systems. But she's letting them. She doesn't care anything about planting timber back. So she's going to let him start working through doing prescribed fires on that parcel, on that property, and letting him manage it just for wildlife.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And again, that's like probably hard to find, but I've heard of other individuals who've talked about leasing property through a larger landowner who kind of sees the value that wildlife provide, from like a leasing price instead of just a timber price. And even if they want to, manage timber on it, doing more of like a savanna cut, kind of like these thin pines that we talked about, and allowing you to be able to do prescribed fires on the property can make a huge difference. And again, the people I know who've had success doing that have leased property through individual landowners, not necessarily through timber companies.
Yeah.
And some of those properties, like, that's why I'm excited to see what Michael's property turns out into, because this spring is when he wants to start doing the first fire on part of that 230 acres. And I've seen photos of it, and it looks unbelievable. Like, dude, you talk about some saddles running across this giant ridge. It's a giant ridge system that they clear cut the whole thing other than the little SMZs and the creek runs through it. And just be able to manage that where you kind of do your old checkerboard effect, bring a dozer in, cut in fire breaks, and be able to rotate certain sections because right now it's like 3 years old. And what Anthony told me was, because Anthony hunted this year, it's the craziest looking clear cut he's ever seen. He's like, it's 3 or 4 years old. There's not a single sweet gum growing in that whole thing.
Oh, wow.
It's nothing but broom sedge and like different forbs and stuff underneath it.
I bet that looks awesome.
Oh, he's like, I've never seen because most clear cuts down here where we're at in Alabama, and probably some of you other listeners and viewers in other parts of Southeast, if you clear cut a property, if you don't plant anything back, sweet gums typically will take over the property very quickly.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because the deer don't eat the leaves, they shade everything out, and within 5-6 years it can be completely closed.
That's the stuff you're killing with a burn.
Yeah, you're trying to kill that big time.
That's why you're burning.
But like how, for whatever reason, that property doesn't have any sweet gums. It's not in the seed bank, and they haven't grown. So Anthony says he's real excited to help Michael out doing some fires out there and seeing like what that property could provide compared to like all his other landowners around there don't do anything.
Dude, we ought to.
And he's got like
he's got
300 acres now that he can do it on because he owns 75, and then he's got the 230 next to it.
Well, I'll go film that. That sounds pretty cool.
Yep. So anyway,
this is this is really interesting. I want people's opinions on this. I want to hear different perspectives. I want to know if there's anybody out there who's discussed something similar with a timber company anywhere across the Southeast. Like, were you able to get anything done? Providing some value for the timber company. Like, hey, instead of doing your herbicide treatment in a couple years, why don't you just let us run some fires through here? Like, working with the timber company to find out something that works for the hunters, the wildlife, and the timber company, and find some kind of relationship like that. So I'd love to hear if there's anybody who's managed to do that so far and hear how they did it and kind of what their structure that was. And then if there's any foresters out there, I got a bunch of forester buddies, but I'd like to hear from those guys. If there's anybody who works at one of these timber companies, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah.
Comment on YouTube, email us on the website, message us on Instagram or Facebook. Just reach out. Like, we want to hear your opinions. Comment on the Facebook post or the Instagram post for this episode. And let's get a discussion going, man. This is a really interesting subject, and this is the time of year to have this conversation, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So, other than that, guys, appreciate y'all watching the podcast. Appreciate y'all listening to the podcast. Again, share the show. If you found this interesting and you learned something from it, share it with some buddies. Share it with some of your friends, and see if y'all can make an impact on y'all's property. But again, appreciate y'all tuning into this week's episode, and we'll catch you back for Thursday's episode from the Southern Outdoorsman podcast. And remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.